December 7th, 1941. The U.S. gets dragged into World War II, and with it go thousands of young men from the New Orleans area.
There were sights which I wish I hadn't seen.
We were all scared to death.
Millions of soldiers lived through the terrible ordeal of war. Many others didn't make it. The ones who did can never forget.
Those men were brave men.
From the horrors of Pearl Harbor to the carnage on the beaches of Normandy and beyond. Soon, the first museum of its kind will honor their bravery. Tonight, we remember all those who fought in World War II and those who helped on the home front in D-Day, the New Orleans Contribution. Good evening, I'm John Snell. In 1941, the Depression was nearing an end, and in New Orleans, a ride on the streetcar would cost you 7 cents. There were no shopping malls. Most people in the city shopped at stores on Canal Street. And high school football dominated the sports pages of the Times-Picayune. Life then was considered by some to be simple. That was about to change. December 7th, 1941. The Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft strike U.S. military installations and inflict a terrible blow to the U.S. Navy fleet. M.J. Goche was there.
I remember one Japanese plane coming by and strafing a whole bunch of the guys standing in between the tents, strafing that, and I don't remember any hitting but 1 or 2 people when he could have killed hundreds. They put me in the truck, and I could see bombs hitting an officer's mess hall, and I could see bodies flying up in the air, maybe 20 feet up in the air.
It was a great victory for the Japanese and a terrible defeat for the United States.
It was the worst defeat in U.S. history. It claimed the lives of 2,335 servicemen, 68 civilians, and it wounded over 1,000. Only 29 Japanese aircraft were shot down. In New Orleans, news of the attack spread quickly.
In the afternoon, my friends and I met downtown and went to a movie at the Lowe's or the Sanger, and that's what we did that day, like any other Sunday. And it wasn't until we came out of the theater that we heard these boys shouting, "Extra, extra, Pearl Harbor bombed." Well, you know, we were 15 years old. We didn't know where Pearl Harbor was or even what a Pearl Harbor was.
I was in the automobile with my dad, and we were coming down St. Claude, and we passed on St. Claude and Frenchman Street. They had a newsstand there, and this guy had the extra out, "Pearl Harbor bombed." And I told my dad, I said, "There we go." I said, "That's it."
And we used to watch the ladies go by when they came out of the show at night, Carrollton show. And that's where I heard about it. Somebody came out and said, well, they just bombed Pearl Harbor. And we all asked, well, what's the difference? What does that mean to us? That don't mean a thing. And we found out later on what it meant.
The following day, Americans were glued to their radios as Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed the nation. The speech they heard became history itself.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
He was such an imposing presence that when he said we were at a state of war, I mean, tears came to your eyes and you had goosebumps all over.
We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
It solved a lot of Roosevelt's problems. Roosevelt wanted to get into the war to help Britain, but he couldn't move the country in that direction. We were still so badly split, right up to December 6, 1941. But the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, the surprise attack, they fired the first shot. They attacked us, and that got everybody behind the war effort and had a miraculous effect on the United States. It turned us from a divided nation into a united nation. Everybody wanted in this war now, and they wanted to win it.
Of course, it's like when a hurricane is coming. You're frightened, but you want to help one another, and there's sort of an adrenaline that pumps. I learned later that there were 100 young men that volunteered on that very day at the Custom House, which was the draft board.
Like many of his friends, Jack Sullivan wanted to enlist. But at the age of 17, his father would not allow it. On the morning of his 18th birthday, Sullivan registered for the draft. Later that day, his dad had a stroke and died.
My feelings changed drastically from a kid who wanted to go do what he's friends with. Now I was the sole support of my mother and my teenage sister. I asked for delay because of my mother's grief, and the draft board unanimously rejected that.
The newly constructed municipal auditorium was intended to accommodate large crowds, conventions, and Mardi Gras balls. During the war, it was used for enlisting.
Huge numbers of people, very confused, go in and take off all your clothes and get in line with a sheet of paper with your name on it and go through a very elaborate physical. At the end of that, an hour or so, longer, you came out and stand there naked with your paper in your hand. They said, call your name, step to this side, call your name, step to this side. The guys on this side are 4F, you can go home, get your clothes. The guys at this side, you've been accepted. And before I left the municipal auditorium, I was a private in the United States Army.
Unemployment in the U.S. just before the war was at a high of 30%, but it quickly dropped to 1% after the war began. Automobile companies halted production of cars. Instead, they made trucks, jeeps, and tanks. Airline factories began making fighter planes and bombers. And in the port city of New Orleans, mass production of war supplies was no exception. With the Mississippi River and a network of railways, the city was an ideal home for factories like Delta and Avondale shipyards. Consolidated Vultee produced the PBY Catalina bomber. But it was this man and his boat company that would be credited with winning the war. His story when we return to D-Day, the New Orleans contribution. At the start of the war, the U.S. began its massive war effort. Factories and military installations were built everywhere. The south shore of Lake Pontchartrain became the destination for wartime industry in New Orleans.
It was intended for residential subdivisions. Now, all these plans were on the table when there was suddenly a moratorium on civilian building. No one could build a house after a certain period of time because all of the lumber and all the other material would be needed for the war effort. So we had this beautiful 5-mile-long stretch that no one could build on, so it was ideal, you see, for war effort installations. So along the lakefront, we had a naval hospital, an army hospital, the consolidated Vultee aircraft building. There was a prisoner of war building, aircraft carrier training center, Camp Leroy Johnson, and then the airport, which was already built, was then leased to the government for the duration of the war. So it was solid military installations.
In the middle of all this was an amusement park called Pontchartrain Beach, and it stayed open throughout the war. The Michoud Defense Assembly Plant was located in eastern New Orleans. In fear of an air attack by the enemy, dummy houses were placed on the roof of the building to disguise the plant as a residential neighborhood. The outcome of the war in Europe depended to a great degree on this question. How in the world were the Allies going to land an army of men onto the beaches of France? The answer came out of the bayous of South Louisiana and from a New Orleans shipbuilder named Andrew Higgins.
So like Farragut, bring the boats on in and damn the obstacles.
Those who knew him said Higgins would knock down anything that got in his way.
Sure, why not?
An outspoken, hot-tempered Irishman, a man of enormous vision, who saw how the next great war would be fought and won a decade before the admirals figured it out.
General Eisenhower said to me at one point that Andy Higgins is the man who won the war for us.
He was the right man in the right place at the right time.
In the 1930s, he was building shallow draft workboats, boats that the trappers and the oil field companies needed to get into the swamps. They had to be able to pull up on the banks of bayous and be able to retract from those banks.
The same qualities needed later to hit the beaches occupied by the Germans and Japanese. What Higgins envisioned became the LCMs, or LCVPs, but what the GIs simply called Higgins boats. Ronald Monalepri landed on several beaches in the Pacific on Higgins boats.
Oh, I think the Higgins boat, I didn't realize what a great contribution that was to the war effort. We would have never been able to do anything without the Higgins boat.
But in the 30s, the Navy brass turned a deaf ear on Higgins' ideas.
He had to fight very hard to get the contract to build the boats. The Navy didn't like him. They thought New Orleans can't build boats. We got to get them out of either Norfolk or someplace on the East Coast where the people know what they're doing when they're making boats.
The feeling was mutual.
He disliked the Navy very much. The Bureau of Ships of the Navy was, he just thought that they didn't know what they were doing.
The Marine Corps loved Higgins and agreed with him on what it would take to land men on beaches. He won a contract to build landing craft and PT boats.
So it was the biggest operation New Orleans has ever seen. And I hear so often in New Orleans, God, we can't do anything right down here. I guarantee you in World War II, New Orleans did it right.
Higgins employed 20,000 workers at 4 yards in New Orleans. At one point in the war, Higgins had built 13,000 boats, 92% of the entire U.S. naval fleet. Historians see Higgins as a production genius, partly because of how his army of workers built boats on an assembly line.
He took the premise of building automobiles and put it into boat building, which no one else had ever done, which most people believed couldn't be done.
In other ways, Higgins was decades ahead of his time. He offered workers daycare. Because of the shortage of labor the war created, Higgins hired more than just white males.
He paid his workers for what they did, not because of the color of their skin, not because they were male or female, not because they were old or young, but if you're on the assembly line doing this or that and the other, everybody gets the same pay.
Production skyrocketed.
In July 1944, Higgins' plants turned out 700 boats in 1 month, which was more landing craft than all of the other 23 companies in the nation combined that built landing craft.
Higgins became famous the world over.
There was a letter sent to Mr. Higgins, and it just said, Andrew Higgins, United States of America. And he received the letter, which shows you how well known he was.
Andrew Higgins is, in fact, the very reason New Orleans is the logical spot for a national museum honoring D-Day, even though his contribution to the Allied victory is no longer always appreciated.
He's practically unknown. He's kind of the forgotten man. The D-Day Museum is going to change that, thankfully.
You'll have to wait for the blueprints. You wanted a boat, and here it is.
With millions of men leaving to fight the war, the workforce needed to build the weapons was seriously depleted. Women at the time were not considered equals in the workplace, but a novelty character on a poster called for women to join the war effort. Rosie the Riveter proved that a woman could be as good as a man.
We had lots of Rosie the Riveters here. It wasn't just a cartoon, it wasn't just a song. I mean, these were women who wanted to go into the war effort. So they left their home, they made arrangements about their children, and they went in, and in many cases, to do jobs that men could not have done because they could fit into small places. They were paid very well. Now, these women worked in building of ships, building of aircraft. Consolidated was on Franklin Avenue and the lakefront. It was an enormous building. They built planes. Now, there were 7,000 employees there, most of whom were women. So they needed them then. Later on, how well they appreciated their being in the workforce is questionable. Some did, some didn't.
With all of the nation's resources being put toward the war effort, the U.S. government enacted a program to conserve certain materials and food products needed for an undertaking this big. In order to buy certain items, a person was issued a ration book containing a certain amount of coupons. Store owners needed to turn in coupons in order to restock their shelves.
And if you went into a grocery store or any other store without your ration book, or to get gasoline for that matter, you'd just as well stay home because money didn't mean anything unless you had your ration book. The things that were rationed there were meat and cheese and milk, sugar. Those were the main things. And meat, you hardly ever saw meat. That all went to the servicemen as it should, and we were happy about that. With gasoline, you were allowed 2 gallons a week unless you were a doctor or you had an emergency or wartime job. We were allowed only 2 pairs of shoes a year. And if you consider that that would be 1 high-heel pair and 1 low-heel pair, then you only had summer shoes or winter shoes, so that was very hard.
When we return, the Normandy invasion, next on D-Day, the New Orleans contribution.
In 1941, we just took a hell of a pounding. In 1942, the comeback began with the invasion of Guadalcanal and the invasion of North Africa at the end of 1942. 1943, we were operating in the Mediterranean. We took Sicily in July of 1943 and invaded Italy later on in that year. In December 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at Tehran. And Roosevelt promised Stalin, we are going to launch the invasion next spring, that is in 1944. And Stalin said, that's wonderful. He'd been begging for that invasion for 3 years by that time. And then he said to Roosevelt, and who's the commander? And Roosevelt said, that hasn't been decided yet. And Stalin said, well, then I don't believe you. I think you guys, that is the British and Americans, are willing to fight to the last Russian. And if you haven't named a commander for this operation that is the invasion of France, then you're not going to do it.
It was not an easy decision for President Roosevelt. He soon chose General Dwight David Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander of Operation Overlord, known today as D-Day.
D-Day is the day we attack. The D-Days occurred everywhere. That is in North Africa and Sicily, at Salerno in Italy, at Normandy, and then all over the Pacific Islands, beginning at Guadalcanal and moving north, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Taiwan, on up to Okinawa. There were a lot of D-Days in World War II.
The phrase D-Day comes from the First World War, when the U.S. Army used it for the very first time in its biggest offensive in 1918. Never in the history of mankind had anything like it been done. In order to liberate France and attack Germany, the Allies first had to penetrate what was known as Hitler's Atlantic Wall. It stretched for 2,000 miles along the coast of France as a defense against an Allied amphibious assault. The plan for Operation Overlord was for American, British, and Canadian troops to cross the English Channel from Great Britain and establish a port of entry in France. Paratroopers would land inland, as well as gliders with troops and equipment. More than 5,000 ships and landing craft would transport 130,000 troops to land on 50 miles of Normandy beaches. The British and Canadians would land on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. The Americans would land on Utah and Omaha beaches. The Germans placed Belgium gates, mines, ramps, and hedgehogs along the shores. At high tide, these obstacles would destroy or prevent landing craft from getting ashore. There were thousands placed along the shores of Normandy. In the first 6 months of 1944, a massive buildup of troops and equipment poured into Great Britain. As plans for the invasion were made, the troops trained and more intelligence was gathered. For the invasion to be successful, the element of surprise was critical.
The Germans figured they're going to come across where the channel is at its narrowest. That is from Dover to Calais. It's only 20 miles wide at that point. A lot was done to convince the Germans that this is where they're going to invade. A dummy army was set up at Dover with George Patton in command because it was known that the Germans regarded Patton as the Allies' best general. So he's certainly going to be in command of Operation Overlord.
Operation Overlord was set for early June 1944, but poor weather conditions forced Eisenhower to delay the invasion. Most men spent nearly a week on board ships in rough seas, and most were seasick. The air below deck was poor with the smell of vomit. It was a trying time for these young men. But word finally came that there would be a break in the weather on June 6th. Because of the changing tide, it would be the Allies' only chance to make the landing. Eisenhower gave the word, go. In the pre-dawn hours of June 6th, paratroopers made their way to the mainland, cutting off enemy communications and taking bridges. Soldiers on ships boarded the landing craft.
Right here in New Orleans, Andy Higgins, who had built all the landing craft that were used in all these invasions, on June 6th had his workers pray, let's hope we did it right, because those are our boats made in New Orleans that are taking the men into this battle. And good Lord Almighty, let's pray that we did it right.
Going in, we could see the ships out at sea firing into the beach. There was so much fire going into that beach, we didn't think anything would be alive there.
At the age of 20, Corporal Bill Gaillot of New Orleans made his way to Omaha Beach on board LCM-10. He was part of a special team known as the Naval Combat Demolition Unit. As part of the first wave to hit the beach, their mission was to blow up obstacles and clear a path for units coming in behind them, all while carrying heavy gear, 40 pounds of explosives, and while under deadly enemy fire.
We got into the water, and we didn't know anything was going on until I was a little bit in the water, and I saw the water splashing, not right near me, but around us. I said, oh my God, it's machine gun fire. And that's what it was. But we got into the beach, and the machine gun fire got really heavy, and mortar fire started coming in.
Gaillot's team landed on the area of beach codenamed Easy Red. They managed to blow up a 40-yard gap. Explosives were placed on more of the hedgehogs. But soon the infantry made its way in.
When the infantry came in, that's how they were hiding behind the obstacles. That's the only place they had. And some of them we had to get out there, especially where we had loaded that second section on some. They were hiding behind them, and if a bullet or something had hit one of them packs, it would have blown them apart. And we all knew that if we didn't get them obstacles down, we were going to be there by ourselves. So we had to get them down. You're scared. Don't tell me you're not. You're scared. But you knew the job had to be done. And we did it pretty well. Enough to get that infantry in.
On the beach, things were quickly deteriorating. As the infantry made its way to shore, many LCVPs hit mines. They killed everyone on board. Troops were dropped off in water so deep they drowned. Enemy gunfire killed soldiers before they could fire their own weapons.
Bodies were coming in. Our chief petty officer, Mills, came in floating up to us right where we were with a big hole in his back. That was something you couldn't, it was rough. But while we were in the shells, I could see the tide was coming up real fast then. And I was looking out. I was telling someone that, I said, look at the boot. The guy ran out of his boots. But when it turned, no, it was a rough part.
When we come back, the second wave on D-Day, the New Orleans contribution. As the first wave of U.S. troops made their way onto Omaha Beach, they were confronted by fierce opposition. The casualties were enormous. If a soldier made it to shore, he had to pass obstacles and mines, all while mortars, artillery, and deadly machine gun fire concentrated on the beach. If a man stayed on the beach, he was sure to die. Reaching the stone-covered shingle provided some cover. Just past the shingle lay barbed wire, and above were reinforced concrete gun emplacements. Those who made it to the shingle were pinned down. Neutralizing the enemy before troops landed on the beach had not gone as planned. B-17 and B-24 bombers were scheduled to hit the beaches and gun emplacements on the bluffs. Because of poor weather and visibility, the bombs failed to hit their targets. Not one bomb fell on the beach. Naval bombardments also failed early on. The Navy relied on small observation planes to direct their gunfire. Troops heading to shore failed to recognize them as Allied planes. They were all shot down. The German fortifications were well built. Some of the artillery that hit them was not effective. Many of the landing craft came in late or landed in the wrong area. Early in the operation, LCTs unloaded tanks in water too high. Most of them sank. The conditions on Omaha Beach were very bleak. Corporal Bill Gayot's job was to blow up obstacles on Sector Easy Red to clear the way for the incoming troops. Another young man from New Orleans moved toward shore in the second wave on the same beach. 23-year-old Captain Frank Walk of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had no idea what the conditions were on the beach. The boat hit a mound of sand and came to a halt.
The coxswain thought that he was ashore. Actually, he was still offshore some. He dropped the ramp. We all went out, and I went out into water up to here. Some of the shorter guys were, drowned really in the water because we were all pretty heavily loaded. But I managed to touch bottom and to sort of ease my way in. Again, there was small arms fire all around me. Some of the people in the landing craft that I was in who did not drown were shot up just all around me. And I managed to get in and to get behind a tank, one of our tanks that had been knocked out in the first go-around. My first impression was that everybody in the first wave didn't survive. Now, some of these bodies were absolutely motionless. Some were moving around. Some were, twisting, turning, moaning, groaning. screaming. It wasn't a pretty sight at all, nor were the sounds very. They were very agonizing in themselves. Of course, along with that was just the sound of intense gunfire.
They had been so badly battered coming in, had taken such losses, that it was all confused there on the beach. So you didn't know the guy to your left. You didn't know the guy to your right. There wasn't even a squad that was together. But over here a captain, over here a lieutenant, over here a sergeant, over here a corporal just said to himself, to hell with this. I can't retreat. If I stay here, I'm going to get killed. By God, I'm going to take some Germans with me. And he'd start up that bluff. And over here, 2 guys would follow, and over here, 3 guys, and over here, 5 guys. And the other people see this, and pretty soon you get a rush going up that hill. And they did it. They got ashore, and they showed a pretty typical American quality here. That is a willingness to take responsibility and to think.
Our engineers were doing a pretty good job of clearing the barbed wire and other things that were across the back end of the beach. And they were doing that with Bangalore torpedoes, so-called.
Men had to go along and grab one another and say, get over here, get over there.
A 37 millimeter gun landed in an LCVP, and he very quickly laid a fire right in the slit of the pillbox. And it was an 88 millimeter gun in there, and that knocked the gun out.
And the infantry had gotten up. They went over the rise. And they were knocking out some of the machine gun nests and some of the snipers. They had quite a bit of snipers.
D-Day afternoon, sort of late, I was making my way up exit E1 back toward toward the bluffs, and there was some infantry soldiers walking ahead of me, and a sniper hit one of these right in the forehead here, and he just fell dead immediately, just right in front of me.
Captain Walk was assigned as the Assistant Traffic Control Officer for Omaha Beach. His commanding officer was in the first wave. When Walk caught up with him, the man could barely function. He was shell-shocked.
So the commanding general, General Bill Hogue, determined that I should take over. And here I was, a 23-year-old captain in charge of the whole of Omaha Beach. We had a big plan ahead of time of just what troops were to land where, and each one of those units knew where they were supposed to land. These plans were frustrated, first of all, by the fact that the landing craft didn't land where they were supposed to in many cases. Secondly, and the big thing was that the beach hadn't been cleared. Therefore, we had to try to redirect the landing craft and the troops to areas that had been cleared, at least to the extent that they could hope to get through.
Despite the large numbers of casualties on the beach, the men made it through. They opened the way to liberate France and invade Germany. There were many contributing factors surrounding the Allied success. The plan to trick the Germans into believing the invasion would be at Calais worked. The Germans were caught off guard. Allied air supremacy kept the German Luftwaffe from counterattacks. And Hitler's failure to allow low-ranking officers to make decisions on their own proved fatal. It was just the opposite for the Allies.
And it was all done by resolution and determination and a willingness of junior officers and enlisted men to take responsibility. We're going to do this. And they did it.
D-Day itself, it was mostly an act of survival. Everybody that was your main object, was to try to live through it so that you could be effective.
You knew automatically what had to be done. If it was out of the way that you hadn't been trained for, it still had to be done. No training in the world can do it perfectly on a battlefield. No way. But there was so much blood and body parts on that beach that I think we were all in a little shock, probably. I think I was, anyway.
The ones who seemed to be bravest before we hit the beach weren't so at all. Those who were quietest and who didn't seem to be all that brave were the ones who turned out to be the heroes, as it were.
That was a great loss for us. You don't forget those things. Some things you want to forget. Others you can't.
Throughout World War II, young men from New Orleans fought in many different battles. We now look at their stories.
The first time we went through it, we stopped in one of the little villages, and when we had to pick up and come back out because the German that's when they threw their everything at soldiers. So we had to come back through the Hudson Forest, and it was a sloppy, cold, black place.
The weather in the winter of 44, 45 was the worst ever in Europe. The coldest, well below zero. And these guys were in their foxholes with water to the ankles or up into the calves that would freeze at night, and then in the thaw of the day it would become water, and they all had leather boots. One consequence of which was trench foot that came over them to such an extent that trench foot put more American soldiers out of action than the Germans did. First, your toes turned black and then purple, and the pain was such that you couldn't walk on them. I've known people who were carried to their foxholes because they couldn't put their feet down on the ground, but they could still fire their weapon.
We had medication for that, and we give that to the soldiers, and we had vats where they would pass and put their feet in and soak them and go ahead on, and we'll give them this little vial of salve or powder, whatever the case might be that we had.
And a lot of them had had the foot amputated, or right up onto the knee was the amputation. That was just one part of what it was like to be a GI in Europe in World War II.
We got an artillery barrage on us, and it hit a tank by me. And the guy was trying to get out the tank, or he was halfway out, and it just tore him all up in here. And everybody else is hollering for medics and everything. And the colonel came and jumped in the hole behind me and says, "Sergeant, get the division headquarters for me." So I cranked up and got division headquarters. He said, "Send the medics up here. We have a lot of men wounded." And he said, "My behind is on fire." And his face is in, his behind is in my face, and I'm looking at it, and all I could see was little holes in his pants. It wasn't funny. And about that time said, "Harold, you bleeding." As a matter of fact, when I got wounded, the boy that took my place, 2 weeks, he was dead. They hit a landmine.
I was on KP, and I'm working around there serving food and all. When we got through, they told me they wanted me to sweep up, and the sergeant hands me a broom, and I look at it, it's brand new. It's this lighthouse for the blind, New Orleans, like the fell through the ground right there. We up front, 7 or 8 of us on each side, and we walking along the rails, foot over foot. All of a sudden, somebody about 4 or 5 behind me, walking down on the rocks between the rails, stepped on a mine, one on each side, stepped almost simultaneously, boom, boom. And I spun around quick, and there were a big hole knocked in the line, about 12, 15 of them on the ground.
In November of 1944, while on patrol in the Vosges Mountains of France, 18-year-old Jack Sullivan and his squad fell under machine gun fire in an open field.
William Kukulski was his name, and he died outright when the Germans opened fire. A bullet went to his head. The thing that always touches me is he wanted to be alive as much as I did, you know. He even said to me that night in the foxhole, I do remember this very vividly, "I'd like to come to New Orleans and see that Mardi Gras." And I said, yeah, we'll do that. You know.
As the group fired at the machine gun, Sullivan ran to his friend Jerry Boyer, who was screaming for help.
The bullet entered the can, and as it went in, it turned because it was deflected. So it slammed into his back, taking part of the tin can with it into his lung. So he had a very serious lung wound. And he was pumping blood like a gas station. Face down, we couldn't get up, and you can't, he wanted to get up. He was in shock, and he was hurt, and he was yelling, and I'm holding him down. You can imagine. It's very difficult. I got up and ran to the guy and got down behind him. But the Germans were really pissed off. You're not supposed to be able to do that, and only someone that young and that stupid would do it, so I couldn't. I mean, that kept that machine gun on us forever. We were pinned down, laying in muddy water. And in my attempts to help him, another guy crawled up to us, shot in the leg, and when the patrol pulled out, they left us there. And the reason for that was because the Germans had called for mortar fire.
The three men were pinned down overnight, and as the morning mist covered the field, they decided to move.
Out of the mist comes 4 Krauts with machine guns. Hand the hook, hands up, get up. So that was it. School was out.
The men were taken to a German headquarters in a small village, and they received no medical attention. Severely injured, Jerry Boyer was separated from the other 2 men.
I was being interrogated, and I asked the German, "Where's my friend?" And he said, "He's tot." I asked the German word for dead. But I thought this meant sleeping. And I said, "He's asleep?" And he said, "Nicht schlafen," not sleeping. "He's tot, dead." He said dead, English. So I knew he was dead.
Sullivan spent the next 5 months as a prisoner of war, most of the time in Stalag 7 near Munich, Germany. Prisoners were forced to fill bomb craters, work on railroads, and on farms. 6 to 8 men shared 1 loaf of bread a day, and each was given a cup of cabbage soup.
Diarrhea was a permanent condition. Now, some guys might have had dysentery, but we probably had advanced diarrhea. The reason I tell you, that's one of the reasons why you lose so much weight, because it's essentially a liquid diet. And, but the talk of food and the trying to get food without getting somebody pointing a gun at you was constant. There was no way to get clean where I was. I had the same clothes on when I was liberated as I had when I was captured. You could whistle it, they'd come to you, how dirty they were, But I would say it's a favorite thing. Food was dominant because there was very little of it.
When Sullivan was captured, he weighed 140 pounds. On April 29, 1945, when he was liberated, he weighed 95.
4 Sherman tanks, filthy, dirty, and all these guys, and they look at us and they throwing food to us, like at a Mardi Gras parade, because we were really hungry. And an American officer came in a Jeep. And he said, "We have 30 minutes. If the infantry doesn't arrive in trucks, the tanks are leaving, and none of you will get on these trucks. These tanks try to ride out. Every man for himself." And so he drove off in his Jeep, and there was a sergeant in that lead tank. And he said, "Forget that. If we turn around, everybody on," which we were going to do anyway. He was a brother. But the infantry arrived, and we really were free at that point. Been upbeat almost ever since.
2 years after the war, Sullivan learned that his friend Jerry Boyer actually survived and was living in the U.S. Seriously injured, the Germans left him for dead, and he was picked up by the French.
In my opinion, you see, it was a just war. And I had come to this conclusion long before the war started because I'd seen Nazism. And so I tell them, you've made a heroic sacrifice. The good Lord's going to greet you and thank you for what you've done for your fellow men. And that always took care of them. I never saw anybody that was wounded seriously say regrets. He always thought, this is the will of God. People who say that they know what a concentration camp is by seeing the pictures have no concept of it, because one of the worst things is the stench. That originally there must have been about 5,000, maybe 6,000 men there. About 2,000-3,000 were alive. Most of them were not able to walk even. So all I did was to take those that I could lift myself, and those who could hobble, we'd put them in the truck, take them to a German hospital. The other concentration camp was for women. Went over there, and to my utter astonishment, they were all walking around. They were very thin, but they were still in fairly good shape. So they pointed to a woman that I'd say was about 29 years of age. And I said, they say that you're responsible for the good health of your fellow prisoners. She made a rosary of these little rolls of black bread, and then she found a pin, bent the pin to be the crucifix. And she said, about 2 o'clock in the morning, when the guards were all gone, I'd say the rosary together with whoever else would want to do it, those around me. And she said that way we encouraged all the prisoners to have hope. She said, now you bless the rosary. I said, look, you've been saying that rosary for 5 years. The good Lord has blessed that many, many times for you. She said, you're a priest, you bless it. I said, I blessed it. Most humbling experience I had.
In the Pacific, it was worse. The weather was brutally hot, and U.S. troops soon discovered that the enemy fought to the death.
Peleliu was a really rough invasion. We suffered many casualties. We took machine gun fire and mortars. Mortars were the thing that bothered me the most because shrapnel would come flying from these things. I've seen artillery go right through an LCVP and just split it in half. We went into the beach with the Marine units, handled the initial casualties that were hit as they hit the beach, and proceeded to do whatever we could and get them back, give them plasma or morphine. I carried enough morphine to equip a hospital. Once you get out the boat and you're confronted with so many casualties at one time, and you just start taking care of casualties and hoping that you don't become one yourself. And it's really a scary, scary time. The smell of vomit, of perspiration, of anything you can think of can never be conveyed in a movie. You can have the most wonderful movies depicting this, what happened, but you can never convey the smell.
Okinawa, we had two suicide planes come at us. We knocked the first one down 6 miles off on the horizon. For the second guy, he was strictly coming at us, and we were pumping lead at him, but he just kept coming. And he knew that we had knocked down his buddy, and we just figured we'd give him a good drink of water. You know, and we did. When he did that, oh man, he went. Iwo Jima, we went in there. We had the battle wagons shooting over our head on the island, and I was up on lookouts, and I could actually see the Marines using the flamethrowers on the caves. That's how close we were.
I was on a Chester at the time, and that was north of Guadalcanal when we were hit. The hole was so big that you could run a fully loaded Army truck through it, because they had the largest torpedoes in the world. And it blew up everything. They caught a crew of about 10 people down below, and in the engine room and the fire room. It was a calm night, but it moved the whole ship over. And we had about 10 fellas up on the main deck that were just washed right over from the opposite wave, you know. It was so hot that the fellas used to sleep on the main deck. And they were up there, and a lot of them were washed over.
When Boyington became the squadron commander, on the ground he was really a pain in the neck. A heavy drinker though, but in the air, boy, I'll tell you, I would fly with him anytime, any place. He was an aggressive, talented pilot. Somebody wanted to name the squadron Boyington's Bastards. And the intelligence officer says, no, you can't do that because it won't get published in the papers. And they finally end up decided to call themselves the Black Sheep. And we became a close-knit group of people. You know, your lives depended upon each other. And when a dogfight starts, you just sort of lose track of everything. You know, I was following Lundeen, and he shot down a zero, and then he banked one way, and I banked the other, and I happened to look back, and there's traces going by me. There was a zero in the tail. And I yelled out to my good friend Bill Case, who was flying in the other section, to help me out, and he went down and took that zero off. I came out, and here's a zero right there, you know, not 150 feet from me, blasted me. When I finally got back and read about what I'd done in the squadron and saw what the Times-Picayune had published, gosh, I thought I was a hero. But I was just another pilot out there.
What they believed in was that we had to end the war. We were in it, we were part of it, and we had to end the war.
When we first got home, we got off the ship in New Jersey, or wherever it was. There were about 6 of us. We kissed the ground. We were back home. We were safe.
Yeah, but a lot of people died in those outfits. And most of the guys I've been able to find from that company, all of them sustained very severe wounds. I was extremely fortunate.
The hard part was when you know, comrades didn't come back. And that first combat tour, we lost 8 pilots. One of them was shot down by our own Navy PT boats, a mistake. And that was a tough event too.
They were willing to give their lives. That was a necessary component. The second one was responsibility. They would feel tremendously responsible for their fellow soldiers.
It took a long time for this country to realize we've got to recognize the World War II veterans. These guys were heroes. We've got to honor them because they're dying off at a rapid rate. They're now into their mid-70s and higher. We're losing 1,000 of them a week of the World War II veterans. And if we're going to do something to honor them, we'd better get at it.
The National D-Day Museum in New Orleans is a tribute to the young men who landed on the beaches of both great oceans, to those who took part in all of the D-Days of World War II, to a generation that quite literally saved democracy and a way of life. For more information, you can contact the National D-Day Museum or visit them online at www.ddaymuseum.org. I'm John Snell. Thanks for watching.